The 1950s and 1960s was the era of American military assistance, but as Pakistan's alliance shifted from the west to the east, so did the mainstay of its air and land forces. The 1965 war marked a defining moment. The Americans had turned off the tap and President Ayub Khan was deeply concerned about finding fresh sources for military equipment. In 1967, while visiting France, the Field Marshal requested President de Gaulle for 200 M47 patterns which the French were replacing with their own AMX-30. However, Pakistan was under a U.S. arms embargo and it neither allowed this transfer nor of the patterns that Pakistan was interested in acquiring from Belgium. Pakistan evaluated tanks manufactured in Europe, but the French AMX-30 was too expensive, and the Germans were not prepared to sell the Leopard for political reasons. After a great deal of effort by Pakistan in mending fences, the Soviets supplied 60 T-59 tanks and some 130mm artillery guns but withheld more because Pakistan was not prepared to be a party to an Asia Security Pact that was in essence anti-Chinese. Ultimately, it was only China that was willing to provide the urgently required hardware. The request for Chinese tanks predated the 1965 war and was probably made after Ayub Khan witnessed its demonstration during a visit to China in 1963. They had agreed to supply 80 T-59 tanks and the first consignment made its debut just after the 1965 war at the Pakistan Day Parade at Rawalpindi on the 23rd of March 1966. The T-59 was a copy of the Soviet T-54A, which represented a turning point in tank design. Instead of a high-low mix of mediums and heavies, a single all-purpose vehicle, the main battle tank, the term was coined by the Soviets, would dominate the future battlefield. The Chinese accepted the T-54 into service in 1959 as the Type 59, with serial production beginning in 1963 with a number of improvements. Chinese military assistance was not limited to only tanks but came across a larger part of the spectrum of the army prior to the 1971 war. Chinese 122mm field guns started replacing the British 25-pounder and US 105mm artillery that dated back to the Second World War. Our woefully inadequate anti-aircraft capabilities were provided a much-needed boost. More 130mm medium guns arrived. Semi-automatic rifles were provided and a plant set up in East Pakistan to manufacture the AK-47 rifles which were considered more suitable for the nature of terrain in the Eastern Wing. With the induction of an increasing number of T-59s, it was obvious to the army that its facilities for the repair and overhaul of tanks were inadequate. In July 1968, Pakistan negotiated a credit offered by the Republic of Czechoslovakia for establishing a workshop at Multan for the overhaul of T-59s, but the project was not cleared by the Soviet Union. Soon after General Yahya became president, he instructed the Secretary of Defense, Syed Ghiyasuddin Ahmed, to request the Chinese to establish a tank manufacturing plant for Pakistan. The request was channeled through the Chinese ambassador to his government, which dispatched a team from the People's Liberation Army for discussions. The team recommended a progressive approach and as a first step, they were prepared to establish a facility to rebuild the T-59. In May 1971, experts from China along with the Pakistani counterparts, surveyed a site near Multan as well as sites around Rawalpindi and finally selected the idyllic location of Taxila with its 3,000 years of history. In July 1971, on behalf of the government of Pakistan, Brigadier Shabir Hussain Shah signed a protocol with an official of the Chinese embassy for a tank rebuild complex. The project was designated as P711 and the project office was established at Chaklala under the Defense Production Division of the Ministry of Defense. Construction of accommodation for the employees at Taxila started in early 1973, followed 2 years later with the construction of the rebuild complex. It consisted of factories and shops to repair and rebuild the engine and hull, manufacture components, engineering support, and the assembly of the tank. Initially all the components for the rebuild were to be supplied by the Chinese, but at a very early stage, the project office initiated a deletion program with the support of the domestic engineering industry as well as the shops and factories that were being established within the complex. The deletion program was a great success and ultimately of the 11,000 components used in the rebuild of the T-59, some 8,000 were manufactured in country. In 1979, the complex was designated as the Heavy Rebuild Factory, HRF, and inaugurated by the President General Zia-ul-Haq, with the first rebuilt T-59 rolling out at the inauguration. The next year the factory went into series production with a yearly capacity to rebuild 100 T-59s and 250 engines. It had taken over 10 years from conception to completion, and it could not have come sooner. The first T-59s to arrive in Pakistan were now 14 years old and badly required overhaul. With the HRF in full gear, for the first time since independence the Armored Corps had a fleet of tanks that was supported by a capability for an in-country repair and rebuild.